Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, The Role of Resident Portfolios in Competency-Based Assessment. This is the 11th installment of this webinar series focused on navigating the shift to competency-based medical education, brought to you by STFM and the AFMRD with support from the ABFM Foundation. We hope you will join us for the 12th installment, Managing Assessment Burden in CBME on November 13th. You can register for this webinar and access the previous webinars in this series at stfm.org/CBME webinars. During this webinar, please utilize the Q&A feature to ask questions of the panelists. Although you may ask questions at any time, designated time has been set aside to answer your questions toward the end of the presentation. Today's panelists are all members of STFM's Competency-Based Medical Education Task Force, which has been instrumental in creating the CBME Toolkit for residency programs. You can access the toolkit at stfm.org/CBME Toolkit. Please join me in welcoming today's panelists. Dr. Priyanka Tulshian, core faculty member at Contra Costa Family Medicine Residency Program. Dr. Aaron Lambert, clinical associate professor and residency program director at Cabarrus Family Medicine Residency, and Pamela Macmillan, Residency GME Administrator Coordinator at the University of Wyoming Family Medicine Residency Program. And now, Dr. Lambert will begin today's presentation.
Hello. We're so glad you could join us today. Like Jenny said, the three of us are members of a task force specially formed by the STFM to study and develop resources to help family medicine residencies transition into this era of competency-based medical education, or CBME. And we are very excited to talk to you today about portfolios. Hopefully, you've been able to join us for one of the many other CBME webinars in the series that you can see on the screen, which are co-marketed with the AFMRD. We've had a pretty record-breaking registration for these events that we're excited about, and every one of these webinars has had at least one member of our task force along with some other CBME subject matter experts. If you have joined us along this journey, we appreciate your audience and your participation. If you are just joining us for the first time, I want to just remind you one more time that all of the material we present today, as well as all of these other completed webinars, are accessible in the toolkit at the address at the top right of your screen. This is free of charge, and you don't even have to be an STFM member. Anyone can access this website and see the slides and watch the presentation and the materials. So, talking about our objectives for today, we want to dive into the resident portfolio and its role in adapting CBME culture into your residency. So we're going to talk about the benefits of a portfolio system and how it fits in with CBME philosophy. We're going to talk about some objective and subjective assessments that can be included in the portfolio, and how you could incorporate these portfolios into your residency program if you're not doing that already. We couldn't talk about portfolios, though, without a quick detour to highlight one of the main pillars of CBME, which is assessments. So we know that the end goal of our residency is for residents to be able to independently perform in practice, taking all of the knowledge and all of the skills that they learned and applying them to the patients in front of them, which is the peak of Miller's pyramid. Assessments really should be, when they are best used, should not be a grade or a judgment or an evaluation, but more a tool to focus the learner's education as they work their way up that pyramid, particularly bullet number 3 there. We are not thinking about grades, or we should be trying not to think about grades as much as competency. The goal isn't to be pass-fail, but to master the material, however many times that takes and however many training tools that takes. So to that end, in order to have a good assessment, you need to have some of the following characteristics. A good assessment tool should be multimodal, which means that we should have multiple types of communication and ways to give feedback to that learner, whether it's written tests, simulated patients, OSCEs, end of rotation feedback. and ideally a lot of direct observation where we're observing them in their clinical work environment and giving them real-time feedback there. The assessment should take place in lots of different settings. We know that family physicians take care of patients in a lot of different places, in the hospital, in the clinic, in nursing homes, on the sideline of football fields. So we need to assess them in each of those settings because the care that we provide there is a little bit different. So we need to see that they are achieving their goals in each of those spaces. It really should be, learners should be assessed by multiple faculty. That helps mitigate some of the inherent biases that we all carry with us, even with the best of intentions. Plus, it gives some added bonus of the learner hearing from people with a variety of life experiences, because we know there are often multiple right ways to do the same thing and to provide the same care. And I think most of us probably all are doing those things, but the last couple might be a little more challenging. And I would encourage you today to think about your own program. Are you in your assessments giving space for reflection? Simple questions, and we have found in our program simple questions to the learner, like, how do you think that patient encounter went? Or how did it feel to do it now compared to the last time that you did it? Those are often really insightful questions, and we can learn a lot from what the learner perceives about themselves and their own performance. And then the last quality is continuous review. So we should always be asking, is this the right way to assess this skill? Is there a better way? Is there a different way? Is there an additional way, a new angle or a new perspective? We should ask it of ourselves. We should ask it of our faculty. We should ask it of our learners. Ask the learner, is there a better way for me to assess how you're doing with this? Ask it of your nursing staff and your clinic or hospital staff as well. Get a lot of perspectives in, because there can always be improvements to the things that we are doing. So what are portfolios? The question of the day. Some of you might already be using some built-in portfolios that are included in programming like New Innovations or MedHub, which are a great place to start. They are really helpful in helping collect and store data points. But I would challenge you to think of portfolios not just as a repository of data, but a space for reflection and growth. Portfolios are instruments or tools to collect and assess evidence of a learner's progression. And we want to allow that space for reflection so that the learner can work on those master adaptive learner skills that we heard about in a previous webinar. Think about that friend you had in college who was an art major, who carried around that big leather portfolio of their work, or maybe an English major, or maybe you were that person in college and you were that art major, English major. Those portfolios don't just contain their best work, but they usually contain their earlier work as well, so that they can see and demonstrate that growth over time. I started out like this, and now look what I can do. This is what we need from our residents as well. Not just, have you ever delivered bad news? Check the box. But tell me about how it felt to deliver bad news and lead that conversation this time compared to last time you did it, or compared to your intern year. These portfolios allow the learner to show their growth, not just to us as faculty to attest to their competence, but I would propose that it helps show the learner that they have grown. Sometimes in residency, we don't realize how much we've learned and how much we've grown until we see where we've come from. So portfolios have that added ability to put in those struggles earlier in residency and put in that early work, so that when you progress on, you can look back and see how far you've come and gain confidence, and hopefully have a little less imposter syndrome when you go out into practice. Portfolios also allow us to organize all this data by those 15 core outcomes. And so programs can feel comfortable attesting to their competence. Portfolios have a great advantage when we think about the principles of CBME. It is very easy to collect multimodal assessments and organize them the way you want. It certainly requires some learner engagement and reflection, and some work with your coach or advisor on individual learning plans and reviews. So, I think they have a lot of advantages, but definitely require work. If you are using those portfolios within another program that is a collection of data points, I will challenge you once again, think about how can I do this differently, or um, how can I tweak things a little bit to make this really a living, dynamic collection of assessment that the resident is building throughout their tenure in residency? How can I use this to help them show their strong points and their growth edges and let them reflect on conversations? It's going to take some prompting, but I think it's really a great way for them to demonstrate those things. So best practices for portfolios, we have a few. We should certainly organize portfolios by the competency we want the learner to demonstrate. In this case, our 15 core outcomes from the ABFM. We should have some learning objectives for guidance. Learners need a little bit of guardrails and prompts for what to include, and maybe some prompts for reflections to write, and discussions with their advisor or their coach. Maybe we noticed something that they didn't. Maybe their feedback has mentioned that they're a little too quiet and they need to assert themselves more, but the learner hasn't picked up on that yet. And the coach or advisor can say, you know, I've noticed kind of this trend. Have you seen this? Why do you think that is? And how do you think that is impacting your patient care, your relationship with your patients or your staff? We can prompt those things. It doesn't have to be completely learner guided. If we see a growth area, we can prompt those things in them as well. And so that's a little bit of an overview of portfolios and introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tulshian to talk about how to actually create one.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to kind of take you through some steps that you can use as a way to, if you haven't already started your portfolio, making a portfolio, consider including that as part of your program. Or if you already have one, maybe this will help provide some tips into how to improve on it. So we're going to go through about 6 steps, some of which Pamela will help me at the end as well. So the first step is to keep the end in mind. So when you want to keep the end in mind, what is the ending in this situation? Next slide. The ending in this situation is our 15 core outcomes, right? So we know that by the end of graduation, or at time of graduation, we want our residents we want to be able to say that the residents can be independent and competent in all 15 of these outcomes. And as a program, we're going to now be required by the end of next year to attest to all 15. So keeping this in mind, we want to make sure that everything that we're doing around the portfolio is going to help us with this end goal. So the next step is establishing evidence. So what exactly can go into a portfolio? So evidence in the portfolio can be collected both, and should be collected both, by the program and the resident. And this kind of co-production between faculty and residents is very important. And it's an integral part of the CBME framework, where the learner is as involved in their learning as the faculty is in promoting their learning. And learner involvement is very essential in the success of a portfolio. And so you can see that we've kind of given examples of some assessments that can be program driven. So these include things like procedure logs or rotation feedback, direct observation, which again, as Dr. Lambert pointed out, is very important. Maybe ITE exams, OSCEs. And if you look at this list, you can see probably majority of us rely on rotation feedback as the main source of assessment. And we link a lot of that rotation feedback to the milestones, which we've been using for several years now. So one thing I want to highlight is that the rotation feedback and therefore the milestones are really just one type of assessment. You want to make sure that you have several different types of assessments, just like we talked about earlier around the framework of CBME. So you can't just use milestones. They weren't intended to be the end and be all of assessment. So you want to include multiple different types of assessments. For the learner side, as you can see, this is a space where they can do some self-reflection. This is where they can collect any scholarship work that they might have done. So if they're doing a presentation at STFM, or they did a noon conference, or they did a QI project, a lot of those assessments are more resident driven, and these actually should be included in the resident portfolio. And because they again they can show competency in various outcomes depending on what the project is and what they're doing. Again, reflection is a big part of this, and so ensuring that there's space for them to reflect and they're encouraged to reflect will be really important. Okay, and then if you are still struggling with finding sources of assessments, we have the assessment starter pack. It's located in the STFM toolkit, and basically the way it works, if this is an example, it's a few pages long, but when you open it, you'll see outcomes on the left. So each of the core outcomes are on the left, and they also underneath it list the milestones that are associated with that outcome. In the middle column, you'll see any of the ACGME associated program requirements that kind of correlate to the outcome listed on the left. And then we have examples of different tools that you could use as an assessment that would then therefore help decide if the resident is competent or able to practice independently in relation to that outcome. If you look through the starter kit, you'll see that you're probably doing a lot of these assessments already, and they just maybe need to be tweaked a little to kind of correlate more to the outcome that you're going to be evaluating on, and or they might help you see if there's any gaps in your assessments that you could quickly pull a tool for to try to establish. And then the toolkit is going to be located. The link to the toolkit will be in the chat as well. Now, once you've had all the evidence, you've decided what evidence you want to use for resident assessment, you need to find a way to organize it. And organizing evidence, there's so many different ways that you can decide to do that. And this is where it'll take a little bit of creativity and thinking about how your program works, both from the technology side, the faculty, and the residents, and seeing what might be the easiest. The example here that I chose to use is Microsoft Notebook. So we use a lot of Microsoft products. So one of the things that they have is a notebook. And so each resident would get a notebook and would have a notebook where they would collect all of their assessments. And so you can see on the left, each core outcome is listed on the left. And then when you click on one of the outcomes, there's an introduction which lays out what the outcome is. This is helpful for both faculty and residents alike as a reminder. And then underneath that is all the different types of assessments that we've decided to link to this core outcome. So as you can see, there are rotation assessments. Those are kind of your typical end of the year end of rotation evaluations that you might be using, direct observation. And for this particular outcome, it's around continuity of care. So we've included things like continuity data reports and chart reviews as an opportunity to collect more assessments. And then there's also space for personal reflection. Just to continue and show an example of what personal reflection might be. And so as you can see, there's a prompt here. It's just a small prompt where perhaps we give a little bit of information of how the resident might want to think about it and what they could write. And they can basically just type it right underneath there. So it doesn't have to be in a special place. It's all, again, just collected right in the notebook. As another example, just to kind of show more ways that are other examples of assessments, you can see that here, core outcome 10, which is the lifelong learning outcome, where you have to model lifelong learning. There's a bunch of different assessments under there. So this is where this program chose to put in the ILP to correspond to this outcome, IT exam scores, any kind of scholarship work is also included here. Any times where they're doing any teaching activities as a resident, any assessments you might do of their teaching can also be located here. So again, the importance is to figure out a way to organize your portfolio, and making sure that all the assessments are included. And Microsoft Notebook is one way to do it. Another way could just be a physical binder where if you're still doing paper evals, where you can collect all the paper evals. Some people also use New Innovations, and if you can use that to kind of collect all your evaluations. It's a little bit difficult to import things like scholarship work into new innovations, but that might be a space if you can tweak new innovations to do that as well. So you've now organized your evidence. The next few steps, or the last two steps, are really about how these portfolios now play into CBME and how the CBME framework and how you use the portfolio. So you want to make sure that after you've collected all the evidence, you have a way to organize the evidence. Now it's time to review the assessments and set goals. So this is considered formative feedback. And so the idea is that the learner and the advisor are going to meet periodically, hopefully more than just once or twice a year. And this is where it can be informal, and it's a very dynamic process between the learner and their coach or advisor. So it's a conversation, it's a dialogue back and forth. It's supposed to be much more informal, where both the coach and the learner are reviewing their portfolios, looking for any areas where they might need to have more assessments because they're missing assessments for core outcomes, or as Dr. Lambert had pointed out earlier, it might be a space where they start reviewing the assessments and looking for common themes around strengths to ensure that the resident is continuing to advance those strengths, as well as any themes around growth edges that they might have that either need more formal intervention and or just reflection and goal setting. And so this, again, is a space where the learner should be encouraged to reflect on what they see in reviewing their portfolio, any missing gaps, any strengths, any future goals that they might have. And this is where you could work on the ILP and set SMART goals and kind of prepare for the next stage of their learning. And the idea is that this kind of process helps create a narrative for the learner's progress rather than just, oh, you did this, checklist, grade. It should really be, much more a story, and looking at that story when you're doing that. So here, learners should be the ones that are collecting evidence. Again, it's both their successes and their failures. So it should be a whole portfolio that should really just symbolize their entire journey as a resident. Like we talked about, they should be able to engage with core outcomes. So you're going to want to make sure that they know how to organize it too, because they should be very familiar with core outcomes. So they should be able to recognize which forms of evidence might go into their core outcomes. They should be the ones writing reflections to show that they understand what the core outcomes are, understand what their competencies are, and again, preparing their ILP with SMART objectives. And as an advisor, again, you want to look for any patterns of performance and help them kind of direct their goals and their objectives and their ILPs. You want to make sure that the reflection that's happening is accurate and adequate based on the evidence that's presented. So that you're ensuring that the resident is actually gleaning the appropriate information from all their evaluations. Next slide.
And now we are going to move on to the summary part, or the summarization part of our portfolios. And so thank you, Dr. Tulshian. She just talked about the formative piece of this. So now we're going to talk about the summative piece. And this is more of the piece where the overall picture, or the bird's eye view, is used from the CCC. And so this is what we're using. We're taking all of this information that's been collected within each resident's portfolio over time to be able to attest to the resident meeting these competencies and moving on within residency from one year to the next, and making sure that they're able to sit for their family medicine boards. And this is some of those pieces that we're going to use. So it's more structured. This is the piece that the CCC is reviewing when they're looking at each resident. They're looking at all those milestones, all of that information, and making sure that they're achieving the things that need to be done in order to advance on. The advisors obviously are reviewing all of this information prior to the CCC meeting, and there's actually structure to this piece of the summative portion of the portfolio. Here again is another example of a resident portfolio, as Dr. Thilthamy just mentioned. This is part of that notebook that she was mentioning. Keep in mind, all programs are going to do this differently. And so this piece is available to the CCC to be able to make sure that those outcomes are being met and making sure that those entrustment scales that we've kind of shifted from entrustment to now the core outcomes. But we want to make sure that those competencies are being met throughout the resident or throughout the learner's tenure within the program. Again, this is just to summarize the steps of creating your portfolio. Keep in mind that all programs do this differently. This is just a pyramid graph to show you kind of the pieces that come together. So we have that evidence database, that informal feedback that the residents are getting from their advisors via phone calls or emails with their advisors, and those scheduled meetings that are happening, all of that formative assessment information that's coming to us. And then, of course, this creates our summative assessment. You want to make sure that you're reviewing all of this evidence. That involves the residents' engagement, obviously them setting their goals. And lastly, you want to summarize the assessments or evidence to assist the learners in their advancement.
Pamela, we had a question come up that I think you could speak to about new innovations.
Sure.
Somebody asked, will there be a way built into new innovations so that everything can be put in one place like this? That they like the OneNote, Microsoft OneNote idea, but it would be a little more seamless if it was all together in new innovation. So we use MedHub at our program. So could you speak to that a little bit?
So I can't speak for new innovations, but I can speak as a super user in new innovations. That would be absolutely wonderful if all of this would come together in a portfolio. I will tell you that there is a place within new innovations under the portfolio option that you can pull a lot of this information into when you're creating your reviews, and it pulls over all this information. There's widgets that you can select. And you can also upload documents to that review, and so the advisor can look at those when they're doing those reviews, and also the program director can look at those and the CCC. So we would love for it all to come together in one lovely package. And I think the goal is to get to that. We have been working closely with new innovations, and so I think that they're on board with that. It's just moving to that as we shift through all of these transitions.
Great, thank you.
And along those lines, Dr. Tulshian, we had another question about the sample portfolio that you showed a few slides ago. Wanted to know, did you set that up on Microsoft Notebook yourself, or where did that come from?
Yes, so if you go to Microsoft Notebook, if that's something that you have access to as a program, then you can basically create a notebook. And I created a sample, and then you're able to copy that. So you don't have to create. So once you create the notebook and you have the core outcomes and all of the assessments you might want for the resident, you can basically copy that notebook X number of times for each of your residents, and then grant them access and their coach or advisor access, so that not everyone has access to everyone's notebook, but just the important players for that particular resident.
And I will add, our program transitioned to portfolios this year and are using Microsoft OneNote as well. And it was new to me, used Microsoft forever, but OneNote I hadn't used before. So it was kind of a learning curve for some of the old folks like me, but I will tell you, our residents have been using it for years. That's what many of them take their notes on in medical school, and they were very familiar with OneNote. So it was not hard at all. It was something that they could navigate very easily.
Yes, and if you do want to use that, just like in new innovations, you can pull things in the notebook. Also, you can create links that link to other, shared files, or you can create copies and just kind of drag the copy into the notebook. And then when you click on that little picked icon that's been attached, it'll pop up. So there's ways to kind of have, if you don't want to copy the whole page, you can just have a link to the document, or copy the document as a link.
And is there a way, I know there participant asked, is there a way that you could share kind of what was in that sample notebook if people wanted to get started beyond what's on the board,
Sure.
I guess?
Sure. I think I mean, I'm happy to send it individually to those that want it as an example. And also these slides will be available. And for the assessments, I really just use the outcome assessment starter pack that's on the that's in the toolkit. So that's another great place to start. But I'm happy to share the portfolio as in its entirety to those that are interested.
And
Oh,
Jenny is going to
yeah.
post a file of the portfolio on the website if you're
Great.
interested.
Great. I will send that to Jenny after that.
So another question kind of tied into some of the lessons we've learned so far from trying to from implementing this. Someone asked, some residents are more reflective than others. And do you use any prompts to help them think more on how they're progressing on the core outcomes? And I would say from our program standpoint, a resounding yes. I think any of us, even as faculty, if we're asked a very general question, we like to have prompts and some guidelines. So that first bullet point there, residents will need some protected time for this. This is very different work than we have ever asked them to do before. They'll need more frequent meetings with their coach or advisor, most likely. So your faculty will need a little bit more time, especially in the beginning. You don't necessarily have to give them enough time to do their entire portfolio, but I do think a little bit so that they can balance it. If you want to set yourselves up for success, giving some protected time, but also clear direction. So we've used prompts throughout the portfolio and sometimes multi-layered prompts asking them if they have ever experienced, this particular thing and then how did it feel or how was it compared to last time and a couple of deeper probing questions. And we actually just did our CCC meeting this morning, reviewing portfolios for the first time. And I was pleasantly surprised. There were definitely variations from one resident to the other. Of some wrote a lot more than others, but we kind of took it as this was our practice round and getting started. And if the resident just sorted the data into the right core outcomes, that was the start. And some of them did more than that and filled out those prompts, but we definitely got more responses than we have in the past. So I think having some of that clear direction is really important, however you choose to do it. It's also important to be clear who is responsible for what. So there are a lot of different assessments that happen. Who's responsible for putting them in the portfolio and deciding. In our program, we were very clear that we created an additional folder in their portfolio that was just titled Unsorted Documents. And there is a list of evaluations like rotation evaluations and in-training scores and patient feedback forms, things like that we agreed as a program, we will drop them all in that unsorted documents folder. And then it is on the resident to decide which core outcome or multiple core outcomes that those assessments speak to and sort them into the right folders from there. It's on the resident to write reflections, write those responses either to question prompts or write the questions. So biggest thing is give everybody a lot of grace, set your expectations low for getting started and take those small steps and then build on it.
Okay, so to summarize some take-home points, remembering that the portfolios are a longitudinal tool and they're used to gather the subjective, which is oftentimes what might be the reflection pieces, and objective assessments for residents. Again, really encourage you guys to make sure that we're not just using milestones as forms of assessments or in that space. So thinking about other forms of objective assessments that you might be able to use. Remembering that the portfolios fit well into the CBME framework as they include multimodal assessments, they include individualized learning plans, self-reflection, and a lot of resident engagement. And again, this speaks to the fact that the portfolios work best when there's a collaboration between residents and advisor or coach. Dr. Lambert kind of showed an example of how residents can be really engaged with their portfolios when they're kind of asked to sort the assessments out themselves. So that really makes them think about the core outcomes, makes them think about their assessments, and allows for that dynamic process. And I know this can, and we all know that this can seem very daunting, but hopefully you've seen that a lot of the assessments that we mentioned, you probably are already doing in some way, shape, or form, and can easily be adapted into the beginnings of a portfolio. And taking those small steps are really important. And so some practice recommendations, again, making sure that you thinking about utilizing portfolios as a way of organizing all of the data that you're collecting on resident performance, and maybe allowing for this more active participation for resident learners in collecting that data. So they're now responsible for collecting that data. It also helps increase their self-confidence around their learning. And lastly, switching to the portfolio assessment allows for resident files that are much more consistent with the core outcomes, which will help the CCC and the program director around attestation practices during graduation and help make sure that the residents can sit for their boards. Different resources that we have, we've mentioned the toolkit. Again, the webinars kind of can talk about a lot of different aspects about the CBME, and also this particular webinar will be available as well. There's faculty development delivered, where if your program wants extra support, you can look into that. There's a lot of ECGME learnings around CBME and portfolios. There's the PD toolbox. There's learning collaboratives. And a lot of us have been and others have been sharing experiences at national and regional conferences. This is a link to this toolkit. And then we have a brief poll question before we go to answering more questions. The poll question is, you can choose all of the above or whichever that apply, is really just to look at if the objectives have been met, including discovering the benefits of a portfolio system and its significance with competency-based medical education, demonstrate objective and subjective assessments that can be included in the portfolio, and be able to discuss incorporation of portfolios and corresponding assessments into residency programs while implementing CBME. So hopefully you guys can take a moment to help us out.
And while people are filling out that poll, we had another great question. If all the evaluations are in the portfolio and the residents always have access to it, can they see the direct evaluation forms? The concern there is about one-off evaluations or hurtful evaluations being seen by the residents before the faculty can kind of put them into context. And I can speak to that. I think it depends on how your evaluation system is set up. Some of our evaluations right now are already set up that as soon as they're completed, they are emailed directly to the resident. Ideally, we should be training our faculty that if you ever have really concerning feedback to be given, it should always be discussed with the resident in person before something written is submitted, so they're not caught off guard and so that they can have that conversation. I know though sometimes these evaluations come from people outside our department or outside our sphere of influence. So I would just say I do believe that learners should be able to at least eventually see all of the feedback that is about them or to them. But I also agree, sometimes we need to put it into context. So I would encourage you to look at the delivery mechanisms that you already have in place for evaluations and see if those need to be changed. The trade-off for that, though, is if they always filter to a faculty or an admin person first, that person really needs to stay on top of checking for those so that the residents are getting very timely feedback. That is a great opportunity, though, in a portfolio if they get really constructive feedback or even feedback with very inappropriate language. That's a great point for them to write a reflection and say, you know, I think they've got a point, even though they didn't say it nicely, or I disagree with this. I don't think that's accurate. They didn't see what I did in the room, or, you know, it gives them a chance to respond to the feedback in their portfolio. So that is part of the documentation. and helps them show their professionalism as well. So I hope that was helpful with that question.
And I think there's one more question.
Yeah, Dr. Tulshian, if you'd like to field this, someone asked, is
Sure.
the portfolio the same as an ILP or an individualized learning plan? And that's a great question.
Great. So the individualized learning plan is a aspect, or in some ways a type of assessment that's included in the portfolio. So again, the individualized learning plan was really focused on the resident addressing their strengths and their weaknesses and considering what goals they might want to have for the next cycle or for the next year. It's a place where they might write their SMART objectives to help reflect on and work on. But the portfolio is kind of the bigger piece. And so the ILP is like one file in the portfolio, because the portfolio would also have end of rotation evaluations. It might have their ITE exams. It might have any scholarship work that they've done, any patient evaluations, team evaluations, chart reviews. So the portfolio is really much bigger than that and contains a lot of different types of assessments. And one of them is the ILP, because we want to see how residents are engaging in their learning. How are they setting goals for themselves based on evidence that they've gathered. So the ILP does rely on other assessments that are in the portfolio, hopefully, right? Because they're looking at those assessments to help guide their ILP. And for example, in our program, actually, not only do the residents fill out the ILP, but then there's actually a little reflection piece around that between them and the coach, where they talk about how that exercise is helping them with their education and their learning. So we actually kind of do a little assessment on their ILP itself. So that's another way to use it. But the ILP should be an important part of the portfolio, but is not the whole portfolio.
Yeah, I think about the portfolio as feeding into the ILP. So at our program, we just did our portfolio review this morning, and afterward, we write a letter to that individual resident to say, we've looked at your portfolio. Here are what we see as your strengths. Here are places that we need more evidence or we have room to grow. Be thinking about what learning goals you would like to set in your ILP for your upcoming meeting with your advisor. And so they kind of use the data from the portfolio to determine the goals of the ILP. So the next question I can take first swing at, and then if you have anything else to add, can you speak more on how you teach the residents to manage the portfolios and get them to buy into it? This is a huge question, very important. I think we definitely have to keep resident assessment burden and work burden in mind, as well as faculty. But a couple of things, and I won't promise that I've got, the golden key for this, but a couple of things that we did that was very helpful. We really emphasized that although this work was different, that it would be more helpful in making that more holistic review. And we emphasized how it gives the learner more of a voice in how they are viewed and perceived in terms of their competence and their mastery. Like gives you a better opportunity than just the written evaluations that other people submit for you. But I would say also showing them that you recognize this additional work that it's going to take and that you are going to give them some protected time. That was really important. And also, as you are developing a portfolio system and expectations and responsibilities, if you can get a few resident champions, maybe you've got some residents who are interested in a career in education and might be more enthusiastic about assessments than average, but get a couple of residents on that team that helps develop the process, both so that you can hear their perspective and keep it in mind, but also then those residents will go and spread the word to their peers. I was on this team that helped develop this. I think it is going to be achievable, and you have kind of that peer support buy-in. So those are a few ideas that we did. I don't know if you had anything else, Priyanka.
Yeah, I think that definitely residents who sometimes struggle with the evaluations, whether getting end of rotation evaluations or maybe their written feedback is can be a little bit difficult. They actually do appreciate the portfolio format because they get to showcase other aspects of their learning and education that might be their strengths. And so that actually has worked in their favor. And so I think showing that there's so many different ways that we're assessing you actually helps the learner realize that there's more than just a few opinions or a few evaluations that are going into it. And then ultimately also just being able to say, you know, we need to be able to have that summative feedback at the end to help you sit for the boards is kind of a motivating factor too, you know, that, hey, without this information, you can't really say that you're competent for this core outcome has sometimes been motivating for those that other things are not as motivating.
Another question, would you give more logistical question, would you give residents time to work on their ILP and portfolio quarterly, semi-annually, monthly, just trying to get a better grasp on how often this realistically needs to be updated? I think that's a tough question that, to be honest, we are still working on ourselves. I'm not sure that there is an entirely right answer. I will say, I think we need to really get in the mindset of thinking of both portfolios and ILPs as dynamic documents that are constantly being updated. The difference is, when do we take little changes like, oh, I just got this evaluation, let me drop it into core outcome 11 folder real quick, or write a few sentences reflection, and then you go back to clinic or you go on with your day, versus I'm going to take several hours to sit down and really pound through. We as faculty will do that, right? There are things that we just kind of tweak a little bit as we get a few spare minutes, and then sometimes we have to block off time to sit down and work. We want to try to reflect that kind of work habit in our residents as well. We are planning on trying to give quarterly a chunk of time, like a half day or almost a half day, hopefully quarterly. It's still a work in progress, but they have a little bit of time each week, where very short amount of time, where if they needed to tweak a few small things, they could do that. I don't know if that's the right final answer. I don't know if either of you have a right final answer for that either. I think that's some of the growth of making this kind of adjustment that's going to come to.
I agree with Dr. Lambert. I think all programs are different. We all are, some of us are rural programs, some of us are larger institutions. And so I think it's just finding what works best for your program and how to incorporate that into your residents' day-to-day activities is I think it's a challenge for everybody, no matter where you're at. So you have to, it's a work in progress, right? It's work in progress, just like outcomes and milestones. It's one more thing that we have to add to their plate and to our plate to make sure that it's getting done. And so it's seeing what works, and if it's not working, change it up to make it better for the resident.
And I will say, I do think it's work that is worth it, especially after going through our CCC this morning. It felt so much more holistic to look at a resident one core outcome at a time and say, what evidence do we have that they know how to take care of pediatric patients? Well, here's what's new since last time. One thing we didn't mention is that if you're not familiar with OneNote, there is a timestamp feature where you can filter just things that have been added or edited in the last 2 weeks or 1 month or 3 months. So it's really easy to go in and see what work have they put into it since the last time I looked. And it felt much more applicable and practical to go through and review a resident that way than the checklist kind of folder system we've used before. And we actually got it done faster than going through our old folder system and milestones the way we used to. Once we kind of got used to the flow, it didn't take as long, and it felt more useful to give them good feedback. One thing I will say, and if you're thinking about making this change, you are going to get a mix of reactions from your department, from your faculty, from your residents. You are going to get some faculty who are really excited and want to help you. bring them on board and delegate some work to them so that it's not just one person trying to drive this change, but it's multiple. You're going to get some faculty who are just going to view this as additional work. And it's going to be incumbent upon you to try to demonstrate acknowledge that, yes, it's different work. We've tried to say it's not necessarily harder, it's just different, but that the outcomes are worth it and better. You're going to get some faculty who push back that if you mention giving protected time, that residents are being too coddled. Again, I will say, and I said to my faculty, we have never asked them to do something like this. We don't have to do something like this as faculty unless we are going up for promotion, in which case you fully understand just how much time it takes to organize a portfolio. And this is different work that they have never been asked to do anything like this before. So yeah, if we just throw them in the deep end and say, figure it out on your lunch break or in the evenings, it's not going to work. And it's not going to work because it wasn't properly set up. So if you want it to succeed, yeah, we need to give a little bit of time and some guidance and frequent touches with your advisor, so that we're teaching them a new skill, essentially, that hopefully will be a useful skill for the rest of their careers. Someone asked, we're a new program and our residents will not be here until July 2026. Would you recommend starting this with a new program? 100% yes. I can tell you, we transitioned just our current first and second years because we thought it was too hard to ask a third year to back record 2 years worth of things. And our second years have done great trying to transition mid-residency, but our first years really have embraced it. And I think what we also are noticing is that medical schools are ahead of us, are ahead of GME on CBME and reflective learning. And so our current intern class, and I think the classes after them, are used to being asked to do assignments like this and are used to doing more reflective learning. And so they'll never know anything different. I think they will transition into it very nicely. So I would encourage you to go ahead and take the time between now and July 2026 to kind of figure out what you want to do, and start out right from the very beginning. Someone else mentioned there's a document that's supposed to link the core outcome competencies to the milestones that was going to be on the toolkit, but you can't find it. That is actually being updated and it should be reposted on the toolkit very soon. So check back maybe in a week or so, and that link should be working then. I apologize for that. We just made some updates to it. What they're referring to, there's a mapping document within the CBME toolkit that has the core outcomes on the kind of x-axis and the 19 ACGME milestones on the y-axis, and it just shows which ones associate with the other. So, and the purpose of that is not a graduation requirement. It is not meant to be, they have to check all these boxes to prove competency. The purpose of that is to help your CCC or your advisor if you see a particular deficiency in one core outcome, and the core outcomes are deliberately very vague, and you go, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to make an improvement plan that shows that they know how to communicate well with patients? Then you can associate it with the appropriate milestones, which are more concrete behaviors, and kind of use that to make some remedial activities or learning activities to kind of help them get there. So that is just one more tool in the toolbox, and that should be coming back online on the toolkit here in the very near future. So sorry about that.
It looks like they were asking about the outcome starter packet.
Sorry, wrong entirely.
That's okay. But if you go, I just checked the link real quickly and it is working for me. So if you go to the toolkit and then under the toolkit, you click the button that says assessment tools and strategies, and then go to CBME assessments. And then it's the first document that's listed there, outcomes assessment starter pack. So hopefully that it is working for me. So hopefully it'll work for you as well.
And there's a link in the chat. Well, I think that's probably all the questions we have right now. If you all think of more, we're glad to help as much as we can. I would encourage you to be bold and be brave and start small. Set low expectations, little steps, and once you get that under your belt, add to it and build on it. And I think you are going to find that it is worthwhile as more weight is put on program directors specifically to attest to these core outcomes so that they can graduate. I know I feel better having compiled evidence, and I like that it's the resident's voice that is helping compile that evidence as well. So yeah, I do think it's worth it, and step out and give it a try.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.